Before we begin, a quick warning. Tennessee True Crime contains detailed descriptions and images of real-life violence. Some listeners and viewers may find the material deeply disturbing. This content is intended for mature audiences only. And remember, the goal of sharing these stories is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor the victims, understand the truth, and give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This turn of events is brought to you by Namaste Wellness and Aesthetics. Visit Namaste this entire month of February for 20% off of all skincare needs, $50 off of filler, and $9 per unit of Botox. Go visit the awesome ladies at Namaste. And now, on to the story. On July 29th, 1994, 4 children were inside a house in Madison County, Tennessee, watching television, waiting for bedtime, waiting for their parents to stop fighting. They didn't know the phone line had already been cut. They didn't know that a $25 money order was sitting inside the house like a receipt, waiting for what was coming next. And they didn't know that before the night was over, they would have to carry their youngest sister, a child with cerebral palsy, out of that house and run. Some crimes happen in the dark. This one happened with the lights on and the children watching. This is the case of Billie Hall. They say the South never forgets, and Tennessee, she remembers everything. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime, where the shadows of the volunteer state's past meet the stories that refuse to be forgotten. I'm your host, Tiffany Morgan. Each week, we dig into twisted tales of betrayal, violence, and mystery, the ones where whispers carry truth and the answers are never as simple as they seem. Let's step into the dark and piece together the clues, because in Tennessee, some secrets still haunt the hills. This is Tennessee True Crime.
Down through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs, footsteps fall where the moonlight hides, whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime.
So there's a danger in starting a story like this one at the end, because if you start with the pool, if you start with the body, if you start with the autopsy photos, you miss the part that matters most. The part where everyone involved still believed that this could end differently. John Hall and Billie Hall weren't strangers who collided in a single moment of violence. They were married. They were parents. They were a family, or at least something that looked like one from the outside. Billie had 2 daughters from a previous relationship, Jennifer and Cynthia. John stepped into their lives as a stepfather. And then together, John and Billie had 2 more daughters, Stephanie and Jessica. Now, Jessica, the youngest, lived with cerebral palsy. And that detail matters more than anyone realized at the time. Because caring for a medically fragile child changes the gravity inside of a home. It reshapes routines, it reshapes power, and sometimes it reshapes resentment. John Hall was often described as deeply involved with the children, especially Jessica, feeding her and doing therapy with her, being present in ways that many fathers just aren't. And that devotion would later become part of his defense. But devotion and control often sit right next to each other. Sometimes they wear the same face. By 1994, the marriage between John and Billie was breaking down. They were having serious marital problems. They were living separately, and like most separations that turn dangerous, this one wasn't clean. There were financial pressures and job instability, alcohol, arguments that just didn't resolve, they recycled. And then there was something else running underneath it all, the fear of abandonment. Because when people say, I'm losing everything, what they often mean is, I'm losing control. John wasn't just losing a wife, he was losing access to the house, to the daily rhythms, to the sense of being needed. And to someone like John Hall, being needed wasn't optional. It was oxygen. And here's the thing that we don't talk about enough in true crime. Separation is one of the most dangerous times in a relationship. Not because the love has disappeared, not because anything has gone away in the relationship, but because entitlement doesn't go away. By the summer of 1994, the marriage was fractured, but the arguments had not stopped. They just changed locations. On July 29th, 1994, John Hall made a decision. He was going to Billy's house. Now, he said it was to talk. He wanted to reconcile. He wanted to work things out, go back home. And he brought something with him, a $25 money order, made out to Billy, dated the day of the murder. It was child support. Now, $25 doesn't sound like much, but it's not about the amount. It's about what it represents. Leverage, obligation, proof that he still mattered. And before John Hall ever knocked on the door, he went to the side of the house, to the utility box, and he disconnected the phone line. Let that sit for a moment. Before anyone yelled, before anyone cried, before anyone laid hands on anyone else, the phone was already dead. Now later, John would say he did this because in the past, every time he and Billy argued, she called the police. But that explanation just raises a question that never really goes away. If you're just there to talk, why make sure no one can call for help? Billy answered the door. Inside were the children, and they were watching television. Normal night, normal sounds, normal expectations. Until John pushed his way inside. He didn't ask to come in. He forced his way in. And when he saw the children, Jennifer and Cynthia, Stephanie and Jessica, he told them to go to bed. They didn't immediately obey, and that hesitation mattered. Because what happened next wasn't a discussion at all. John walked right over to the chair that Billy was sitting in and tipped her over. That's the moment that the tone changes. That's when the house stops being a home and becomes a crime scene in progress. John and Billy moved into the bedroom and the door closed. And from their own rooms, the children could hear everything. Things slamming around, furniture moving, their parents yelling. The sounds children recognize as danger, even if they don't yet have the language for it. They tried to go in the bedroom, but the door was blocked. The three oldest girls, Jennifer and Cynthia and Stephanie, weren't having it. They didn't stop. They pushed. They forced their way in. And what they saw was their father attacking their mother. Children stepping into adult violence is one of the most haunting patterns in domestic homicide cases. Because kids don't think in terms of survival. They think in terms of stopping it. They see one parent hurting the other, and they want to help. Cynthia jumped on John's back, and she bit him. But it did not stop him. That detail matters too, because it tells us something so uncomfortable. This wasn't a momentary loss of control. This was a sustained attack, even with witnesses, his own children. Billy told the children to run, to go to a neighbor's house, And that's when John said it. If you go for help, I'm going to kill your mama. That wasn't shouted into the air. It was a warning, a promise. He also told Billy, a college student, she would never live to graduate. Those words weren't about anger. They were about erasure. Cynthia and Stephanie ran to the phone, but it didn't work. Of course it didn't. That's when they fled to a neighbor's house and called 911. Jennifer, the oldest, was the last to leave. She carried her baby sister Jessica, the child with cerebral palsy, because even in chaos, someone still had to be the adult. Before Jennifer left, running with her baby sister Jessica, she saw something that would stay with her forever. She watched John and Billy come out of the bedroom, and she watched John drag her mother outside, kicking, screaming, fighting for her life, across the yard toward the pool. And then she ran. Here's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. At how many points could this have stopped? Because by now, the phone was cut, the children were gone, the neighbors were calling the police, and still, John did not stop. Now, John Hall didn't arrive at that house angry by accident. He didn't disconnect that phone line by reflex. And he didn't threaten his own children without knowing exactly what it meant. By the time law enforcement arrived, the decisions had already been made. And the yard behind that house was about to tell the rest of the story. By the time the first patrol car turned onto the street, the house was already quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that comes after something has been finished. The neighbors could hear sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights washed over the yard. And behind the house, near the pool, John Hall was still there. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood in the backyard, near the water, soaking wet. And when officers asked where Billy was, he said, "She's in the pool." That's how this part of the story begins. Not with panic, not with confusion, with direction. Police moved quickly toward the pool area, and there, floating face down in the water, they found Billy Hall. She was unresponsive. They pulled her out and began CPR immediately. But something was wrong, very wrong. This wasn't a drowning. Billy had obvious visible injuries, severe injuries, to her head, her face, her body. There were bruising. There were lacerations. There was swelling. The kind of injuries that don't come from slipping into the water. She had the kind of injuries that tell a story all by themselves. Emergency responders continued life-saving efforts as she was rushed to the hospital, but the truth was already written on her body. Billy Hall was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. She was 27 years old. And behind the house, the scene that she left behind didn't look like an accident. Investigators began documenting everything. The pool deck, the water, the surrounding yard. There were signs of a struggle everywhere. Agent Bird stepped inside and immediately saw that the master bedroom had been torn apart. Furniture overturned inside the house. Damage to the bedroom, blood stained the bed, the countertop, and even her wedding dress that had been left behind. Inside the house, the telephones hung off their hooks, silent and useless, where the children had tried to call for help. A $25 money order made out to Billy and dated the very day she was killed, sat inside the home like a grim timestamp. No weapon was found. From the bedroom, a trail told the rest of the story. Drag marks and blood led through the front door, across the driveway, past the sandbox, and all the way to the backyard pool. Beside the pool lay Billy's t-shirt. In the water, clumps of grass ripped from the ground floated on the surface, swirling in blood-tinged ripples. Outside the front door, the telephone junction box had been pried open and the line deliberately disconnected. The grass and weeds around it were flattened, as if someone had crouched there, making sure no call for help would ever go through. And then on John Hall's body, there were injuries, scratches, bite marks. Later, John would say those came from Cynthia, his daughter, when she tried to stop him from killing her mother. And that part was true. But the presence of injuries didn't help him. It hurt him, because it confirmed what the children said. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't quick. It was prolonged. Police took John Hall into custody there at the scene. He didn't resist. He never asked about Billy. And that silence mattered. Because when someone truly believes an accident has occurred, they ask questions. At the hospital, the full extent of Billy's injuries were hard to ignore. Her face and head showed multiple impact injuries. Her body bore signs of repeated blows. And the cause of death? Asphyxiation due to drowning after a severe beating. When Dr. Smith began to explain how she died, the story shifted from violent to deliberate. Bruising wrapped both sides of her neck. Deep inside, hemorrhaging surrounded the hyoid bone, an injury that does not happen by accident. The medical examiner found that Billy had suffered extensive blunt force trauma. The thyroid gland was bleeding. The conclusion was unavoidable. Her neck had been compressed with significant force. And that wasn't all. Water was found in her stomach, and water was found in her bloodstream. Strangulation had weakened her. Drowning finished the job. The medical examiner was clear. This was not a single act of rage. It was a sequence. At least 83 separate injuries were documented. Blows to the head, a broken nose, cuts and bruises across her chest, her abdomen, her arms, her legs, even her genitals. Abrasions along her back told another story. One of her body being dragged across pavement. Some of the injuries on her hands and arms were defensive. She fought. Others on her neck, face, and head were described as target wounds, intentional, focused. And here's the chilling part. Aside from the strangulation, none of those injuries alone would have killed her. That means Billy was alive when she went into that pool. Alive and injured and unable to save herself. Now, the prosecution would later argue that John Hall had held Billy underwater, that he forced her head below the surface until she stopped struggling. And the physical evidence, well, it supported that conclusion. This wasn't a fall. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't someone losing their balance near a pool. This was deliberate and intentional and methodical enough to survive scrutiny. Meanwhile, the children were being interviewed. 4 girls, 4 witnesses, each telling their version of the same story, separate but consistent. They described the argument. They described the chair tipping over, the fight in the bedroom, the threats. They described their father telling them he would kill their mother if they left. They described trying to call for help and finding the phone dead. And Jennifer told investigators about the moment she saw her mother being dragged across the yard toward the pool. That image would later become one of the most powerful pieces of testimony in the case because it placed Billy alive and conscious outside. And it placed John in control. And because it destroyed the idea that this happened suddenly, accidentally, or without warning, investigators also confirmed that the phone line had intentionally been disconnected, not damaged during a struggle, not coincidentally disabled, disconnected at the utility box before John ever even entered the house. And that detail alone reshaped the entire case because it showed planning, it showed foresight, it showed premeditation, and it showed that John Hall understood exactly what he was doing and what he wanted to prevent. So, when questioned, John gave his own version. Here we go, right? And of course, he had a different story. John said Billy attacked him. He said he feared for his life. He said he was trying to restrain her. And he said that somehow she ended up in the pool during the struggle, all the way from the house. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems. The injuries didn't match his story. The witnesses didn't match his story. The phone line didn't match his story. And neither did the money order in his pocket. Child support, dated that day. A reminder that he had come prepared, not to reconcile, but to assert control. John Hall was charged with first-degree murder. And from the moment that charge was filed, the case stopped being about what happened and became about why it happened. Because juries don't just decide guilt, they decide intent. And intent is built from patterns, from choices, from moments where someone could have stopped but didn't. By the time Billy Hall was pronounced dead, the physical fight was over. But the battle over the truth had just begun. Because John Hall wasn't going to deny being there. He was going to deny what it meant. While awaiting trial, John Douglas Hall shared a cell block with a man named Chris Dutton. And according to Dutton, Hall talked. He said that night began with a plea. He wanted reconciliation. He wanted his marriage back. But in his words, all she was interested in was the money. When she told him to leave, he said his temper took over and he just started hitting her. But Dutton testified that John Hall admitted something far darker, something he had decided before he ever arrived at the house. He wanted her to feel what he felt, helpless and broken, like her leaving had taken his entire world away. He said he hit her in the head until panic set in, then dragged her outside and threw her into the swimming pool. And next, we step into the courtroom, where the jury would hear those facts, where they would have their hearts broken into pieces, where the children would have to speak, where motive would be argued, and where the defense would try to turn control into caretaking and violence into fear. Trials don't start with the truth. Trials start with posture. Who looks confident? Who looks wounded? Who looks like the kind of person you might trust if you pass them in a grocery store? John Hall sat at the defense table in a suit that didn't quite fit, flanked by his attorneys. He looked calm, not cold, not furious, calm enough to make people wonder, and that also mattered, because the defense wasn't going to argue that Billy Hall died. They weren't even going to argue that John was responsible for putting her in that pool. They were going to argue something more dangerous, that he had no choice. The prosecution went first. They didn't rush. They walked the jury through the marriage, the separation, the arguments, the instability. They talked about control. They talked about fear. They talked about the phone line, that small, deliberate act that told a much bigger story. Because cutting a phone line doesn't happen in a moment of panic. It happens in a moment of intention. Then came the witnesses, those 4 sweet, innocent children. There is no way to prepare a courtroom for that. 4 girls, different ages, different voices, all describing the same night. They talked about the yelling and the chair tipping over and the bedroom door being blocked, how they fought their way inside that room. They talked about biting their father, hitting him, trying everything they could do to pull him off of their mother. They talked about the threat, that if they left to get help, he would kill her. And when Jennifer described carrying Jessica out of that house, the room went silent. Because the jury wasn't just hearing testimony. They were seeing responsibility shift in real time. A child becoming the adult. An adult becoming the threat. During the guilt phase, the defense leaned heavily on psychology. Dr. Lynn Donna Zager, a clinical psychologist, interviewed John Hall multiple times after his arrest. She diagnosed him with depression and alcohol dependence, noting traits of paranoia and emotional dependency. She testified that on the night of the murder, those factors, combined with stressors like financial trouble, a sick child, a failing marriage, a terminally ill brother, led Hall to act impulsively, not with premeditation. But under cross-examination, cracks appeared. Her opinion about intoxication relied entirely on John Hall's own statements and on others who said they had seen him drinking. No one described slurred speech, no staggering, no loss of coordination. The science stopped where his word began. Then prosecutors showed photographs. Not gratuitous, but unavoidable. Injuries to Billy's face, bruising to her head, the condition of the pool area. They brought in the medical examiner. He explained the blunt force trauma. He explained how Billy was still alive when she entered that water. And then he explained something the defense could not outrun. Drowning isn't instant. It takes time. It takes pressure. It takes force. The state argued that John Hall held Billy's head underwater, that he stayed there, that he did not stop when she was struggling for her life, that he did not stop when she couldn't fight back. And that argument didn't require emotion. It only required physics. Then the defense took a turn. They reframed John Hall not as an aggressor, but as a caretaker. They talked about his devotion to Jessica, about him feeding her, doing therapy with her, his patience with her. They suggested that Billy was the volatile one, that she attacked John first, that he was simply trying to restrain her, and that the pool was a complete accident. And then came the most dangerous part of the defense strategy. They put John Hall on the stand. He spoke softly, carefully. He said he loved Billy. He never intended to hurt her. Everything just spiraled out of control. He was afraid of her, afraid of losing his children, afraid of what might happen next. And for a moment, just a moment, the room leaned in. Because fear is relatable. Fear is human. The defense had painted a somber portrait of John. Doctors described him as remorseful and even suicidal, haunted by what he'd done and terrified for his children's future. His former employer called him dependable and a good worker and a devoted father. His sisters and mother testified about a childhood marked by abuse, a father who drank and beat their mother and denied that John was even his son. They spoke of a boy who grew up watching violence, only to repeat it decades later. The parallels were impossible to ignore. But the jury wasn't deciding who John Hall had been. They were deciding who he became that night. And the prosecution didn't even let it sit there. On cross-examination, they dismantled that story piece by piece. If you were afraid, why cut the phone line? Wouldn't you want to have a way to call for help? If this was an accident, why were there so many injuries? More than 83 of them. If you were defending yourself, why threaten your own children? If you were trying to stop the fight, why did you drag her, kicking and screaming for her life, outside, toward the pool? Why not stop when you know that help is coming? John didn't have good answers because, let's face it, there aren't any good answers to those questions. The jury watched, they listened, and they weighed something heavier than guilt: credibility. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated, and when they returned, they didn't take long. John Hall was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. No possibility of parole for decades. As the sentence was read, John showed little to no reaction. No outburst, no collapse, just stillness. The kind that feels less like shock and more like acceptance. The law had spoken. But laws don't explain everything. They don't explain why control turns lethal, why children become witnesses, why a phone line matters more than a weapon. And they don't explain what happens to the people left behind. Because the story doesn't end with a verdict. It lingers. And when a trial ends and the courtroom empties, the judge leaves, the jury goes home, the lawyers move on to the next case. But the people who lived inside the story don't get that luxury. For the Hall children, the verdict didn't bring relief. It brought finality. Their mama wasn't coming back. And their father was going to prison for the rest of his life. There is no clean emotional landing after that. Jennifer and Cynthia were old enough to understand exactly what happened. Old enough to carry guilt that they did not earn in any way. Old enough to replay moments endlessly. What if we'd gotten to the phone sooner? What if we'd pulled harder? What if we hadn't listened when he told us to go to bed? Stephanie was younger, so her memories came in fragments, sounds more than images, yelling, scraping furniture, the feeling that the house itself had turned against them. And Jessica's story was quieter. She couldn't testify the way the others did. She couldn't explain what she had seen or heard. But she lost the same two parents that night, just in different ways. One to death and one to a cell. After the trial, the children were separated. Different guardians, different homes. That separation was meant to protect them, but it also meant something else. They didn't get to heal together. And that's part of trauma that we rarely acknowledge. Survival can be very lonely. John Hall was sent to prison to serve a life sentence, and over the years, he filed appeals. He argued ineffective counsel, procedural errors, claims that evidence had been misunderstood. None of those appeals were successful. The courts repeatedly upheld his conviction because the facts didn't change, and neither did the testimony of the children. Now, in prison, John reportedly kept a low profile. No public remorse, no public confession, just silence. And silence can mean a lot of things. Acceptance, denial, or belief that the system got it wrong. But silence doesn't rewrite history. Outside the prison walls, Billy Hall's name faded from headlines, as it often does. There were no national documentaries, no dramatized retellings, just a local memory held by those who knew her. She was remembered as a student, as a mother, as a woman trying her hardest to start over. And that matters, because when stories like this are told, the violence can eclipse the person. So let's be clear. Billy Hall wasn't a symbol. She wasn't a cautionary tale. She was a human being who tried to leave a relationship, and she paid for it. And that's the truth that lingers. This case isn't about rage. It's about entitlement. It's about what happens when someone believes love gives them ownership. When they believe that separation is betrayal. When they believe that losing control is worse than taking a life. And the most haunting part? The warning signs were there. There had been arguments. There had been threats. And the fear. And the phone line. That small, deliberate choice that told the entire story before it was even over. If there's a lesson here, it isn't neat. It doesn't fit on a poster. It's this. Leaving is often the most dangerous moment. And children, no matter how brave, should never have to stand between violence and survival. Because some nights don't end when the police arrive. Some nights echo forever. Some nights the world goes quiet, too quiet. On July 29th, 1994, it started like any other summer evening in Madison County, and it ended in a way that no one could have imagined. Billy Hall is gone. Her children carry the memory of the screams, the struggle, the dragging forever. And John Hall is locked away, but what about the part of him that never left that backyard? The part of him that acted on something darker than reason, something primal, something that whispers to all of us about what we're capable of when the world doesn't go our way. We like to believe that monsters live elsewhere, in dark alleys and crime shows and headlines we scroll past. But sometimes the monster is in the house, in the marriage, in the home where children should feel safe. So tonight, before you turn the lights off, ask yourself, do you really know the people you love? Or is there a shadow of rage, waiting quietly in the spaces between words? Because sometimes, by the time you hear it, it's already too late. This episode, Before the Water Went Still, was written and hosted by me, Tiffany Morgan, and produced by Main Street Media. Background music and theme song by John T. Productions. Research support from Court Archives. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, we would love to partner with you. Our sponsors keep our shows funded and running. This finale was brought to you by the wonderful folks at Jones & Co. Real Estate. If you are buying or selling a home, come visit us at 304 Mulliken Street or give us a call at 931-474-2020. To support Tennessee True Crime, follow us on Facebook at Tennessee True Crime and Instagram at TN True Crime. You can find case and evidence photos on those socials. We are also now on Spotify and most other streaming platforms. Give us a follow and please leave a rating. If you have a case that you're interested in me covering, please feel free to email me at tntruecrime@mainstreetmedia.llc or reach out on any of those social media platforms. I would love to hear from you. Join me next week as we uncover another Tennessee case that left a lasting mark. Because here in Tennessee, we never stop telling the stories that matter. And some secrets we refuse to let stay buried. Tune in next time on Tennessee True Crime.
Down through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs, footsteps fall where the moonlight hides, whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee. True crime. Dark tales in the mountains where the mist won't lie, echoes of the fallen under starless sky.